Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the D4 Data Channel podcast. I'm your host Deepak, and with me we have Mr. Steven Boylan. Steven has a lot of experience working with different technologies such as 5G, artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, augmented reality in various verticals, which includes smart cities, Industry 4.0, education, fintech, and insurtech. Steven is also a co-founder, mentor, and he is pretty much active in the startup field. So it's a pleasure to have you here today, Steven, and thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be invited.
Great. So I have a couple of questions for you today, and starting with this one. So, what are the common artificial intelligence techniques being used to assess a company's sustainability factor?
Maybe I should explain this. My experience in this comes from a project, an innovation project that we did in ESG scoring with artificial intelligence. So when I talk about that, I'll lean on our experience. So, for example, NLP was a huge part of it, natural language processing. Because obviously with adding a score, you need to analyze data. So you need to find the data, capture the data, process it, and then use it in order to make the score. So NLP plays a huge role. So things like named entity recognition. For things as simple, if you have, for example, finding out if a news article is about a particular company, you want to find information on Apple. So you want to make sure you're not reading stories or processing stories, wasting energy processing stories about the price of apples. So you can do things like instead of just looking for Apple or Apple Inc., you can maybe add the ticker, in the stock market ticker. So you can add that as part of the named entity. And then, when you discover that, you know exactly you're talking about Apple. Basically, you have to kind of build a data set first. Then you use that to look for these named entities. And then basically it brings back information about that, about what you want. Other NLP techniques, I suppose, things like sentiment analysis. So once you've identified that this is, well, maybe topic classification first, because you'd find an article about the company you're interested in, and then you would figure out whether that is ES or G. So you'd see if it's a social, sustainable, environmental topic. Then once it's classified, you could then do a sentiment analysis. So you could kind of see is it neutral? Is it positive? Is it negative? And so these are all the kind of key NLP techniques that would be used. And then, of course, obviously you have a kind of standard data analysis or mathematical models, with prediction and adding scoring and classification, this type of thing.
Got it. Got it. So, what are the common challenges at this moment, like in calculating the sustainability factor?
I mean, in the first instance, I think it's like most AI, it's access to data. So we've done a lot of projects, like I mentioned, a lot of innovation projects, and the biggest problem is always access to data. So companies either are very nervous about sharing data, or perhaps even the data doesn't exist, or they're not allowed to share data, and so it's always access to data. Uh, Another thing in this case, because you're dealing with large industry, you're dealing with companies, is the trustworthiness of the news. So a lot of news out there can be just fake news. Some of the things are quite easy to prove. So if it's like, for example, if a news outlet says that IBM just lost 400 billion, that's quantifiable. You can check their published reports and say, well, that's not true. But if there are things about rumors about, I don't know, company X mistreating their employees, or mistreating female workers or something like that, it generates a lot of negative press. But how then do you prove that that's actually true, that these are actually occurring and it's not just essentially a rumor? So getting to the bottom of that is particularly hard. Also, you have the issue of simply bad reporting. So it can be someone says John Smith, CEO of Apple. You're kind of like, well, that's not true. Or I don't know, Meta reported 100 billion profit this year. when, and they say it was 10 billion or something like that, just simply reporting wrong names, wrong facts. Again, what other problems? Within news, you can have a lot of biased reporting. So essentially, a journalist has a particular hate of an industry or a particular company, and paints whatever it is in very negative terms. So the article is going to be very negative when necessarily it's not that negative, which I suppose kind of falls into clickbait as well. So you have all these clickbaity titles that capture your attention and are by nature really sensationalized, and they create this emotion which can be detected through sentiment analysis, but they're not really. I suppose I don't want to say true, but it doesn't have the same impact as the clickbaity title is reporting. What else? Another thing that we found was with news syndication, because news is essentially syndicated and anyone can pick it up and publish it. So you have a story, whether it's a negative story or a positive story, and it's reported in 40 different outlets, and they're essentially just syndicating the same news. Does that mean that the story is getting massive coverage, or is it just the same story? Is that a huge impact, or is it just the same story being syndicated to fill up column space? Do you know what I mean? So in terms of news verification, I suppose the trustworthy, that would be one thing. Another problem is that reporting. So next year there's this ESG standard within Europe, at least, the EU ESG template, ESG template 2023 or something it's called. That's coming in next year, because in things like in other financial reporting, you have the ways that you report it. It's well established. ESG is lagging behind that. There's also things, there's an awful lot. Again, I'm not a financier, so I don't know the ins and outs of this, but from what I've heard, there's an awful lot of fields within this, and there's an awful lot of data points that have to be reported that not everyone can or knows how to report. So you might have some smaller companies that are not reporting all of the data or simply can't. They don't have access to all of the data. So you're going to have kind of holes in the reporting. And the template comes in, it starts from 2023, but whether all companies will be able to report, from 2023, whether it'll not be a button, it'll not be switch on. Yeah, we have all this data and all this standardized reporting. So that's I suppose that could be problematic.
Correct. Yeah. That actually poses a lot of challenges basically. So, over to the next question. So, what is the primary focus area when applying an AI technique to calculate the ESG score or the sustainability score, actually?
Yeah. In the first instance, like I would say, like I mentioned, it would be NLP. So you basically have all of your techniques for analyzing the information. So the I suppose like topic classification and then sentiment analysis. So these would be the main methodologies or techniques, I would say, that you would use it. And in terms of in the company I'm working for at the minute, usually apply the methodology of visualization of data. So it's essentially simplifying data. So it's providing an interface where the fund manager can screw down into the data and can find the best way of visualizing or interpreting data. And a lot of this can be done through NLP techniques. So you analyze large data, reduce it, and put it into short texts. What else? I suppose you could say another maybe secondary technique, which will probably become more important next year when this EU template is released, would be introducing kind of machine learning algorithms to identify controversies. So controversies being essentially information that companies don't report. So, if there are, maybe there are things that small companies can't report. I don't know, their entire CO2 output. That might be difficult for a small office to calculate. But so if you're looking at their ESG score and that's not there, it's not necessarily suspicious. But if you look at the score of the ethnicity of the workplace, and that's not there, then those kind of things could be controversial. You're going to say, okay, well, why? That's easy to report on. Why is it not in your reporting? So it's kind of like, when like in the movies, when they catch a mafia guy and he pleads the fifth, and it's kind of it's kind of like him saying he's guilty, but he's not saying it, and his silence is kind of an admission of guilt. So it could be, and once these types of reportings become commonplace, that the things that companies leave out are more telling than the things they put in.
Got it, got it. That makes a lot of sense actually. So to my next question. So regarding the data sources, so like what are the primary data sources used while computing a company's sustainability factor?
Standard things are like documentation. So when the company releases its annual reports, all the documentation that the company reports. Another key outlet would be news outlets. So you have things like Bloomberg, the Reuters platform, which is Icon. So these kind of things provide an awful lot of information. And then, another thing is finding, and this is kind of a bit of secret sauce, is finding alternative data sources. So through like intelligent web scraping and things like this, finding unstructured data sources, so maybe even social media, this type of thing. But then once you start going into alternative data sources, then you need a lot of verification techniques, because it's not necessarily, it could be like your anti-Kate's Facebook webpage, where they say where it starts getting into UFO conspiracy theory and this type of thing. So it can be problematic looking for alternative data sources. But I'd say the main sources would be essentially the company reporting and then the big news platforms.
So have you come across with ESG social aspect producing any sort of biased result in your experience actually?
Yes and no. We do a lot of filtering for basically garbage, So we kind of, we don't have any stories directly, but because this came as a result of innovation, there was a large part, an innovation project. There was a large part in kind of the filtering out bias. So things like the old computer science adage, garbage in, garbage out, applies here. So if you're bringing in notes from the UFO conspiracy website on Facebook, you're going to get a lot of a lot of bias. So in the first instance, you have to filter out garbage, and you can kind of rate news sources. So there are sensationalist news sources that can be treated as low priority, and there are, like, I don't know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, which would be considered to have, or the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which would be considered to have a bit more cachet when it comes to reporting. You can go into standard standard bias checking within AI. So you can have things like having a diverse team that's programming the AI. So you're based in India. So if you have a team building AI models, their own experience, which can lead to the biases being introduced in the programming, could be. I'm not saying they are, but they could be very much introduced. What do you call, biased by your culture, by by your markets. European team might actually have a very different view on it and might introduce different biases. Again, a team from Singapore, a team from San Francisco would have very different views. So, just generally across the board in AI, it's really quite useful to have diversity from the start and build that into any model you're working. It's the same in any team. You're building any team in any office. If you have the kind of, white men in grey suits, you're only going to get one opinion. You're only going to see things from one point of view. So if you have a much more diverse team, then you're going to get different points of views. There is a thing which has been commonly known as greenwashing, which I think will become much more commonplace. So greenwashing takes place when, let's just say a company's reporting its carbon emissions, and let's just make up some numbers. So I have a factory, and I'm producing, I don't know, 1,000 tons of CO2 a year. And I open 2 more factories, but they're slightly more efficient. So I end up, instead of 3,000 tons, I end up with 2,800 a year. So I have increased my company's output by 1,800 tons. But if I report it as a ratio, these are called carbon intensity numbers. So if I do it as a ratio per factory, I've decreased slightly. So if I just report the carbon intensity numbers, then it looks like I'm doing a lot to reduce my carbon footprint. But in reality, I've added almost twice the amount of carbon I had last year. So you can do these things that are kind of greenwashing, and if you don't look out for that, then you're getting biased towards these type of figures, because it looks very positive when it turns out in the end not to be super positive. So you have to kind of watch out how companies report and be aware of these kind of things, which is a huge part of it. So if you're not aware that exists, then you go, wow, that's fantastic. They're reducing their carbon footprint, and other things. I mean, a lot of websites report. You have like happy text on the corporate responsibilities pages. So if you look at any of these, it's an exercise in how to write nothing, how to write absolutely nothing in 4 paragraphs. It's, we adhere to the latest laws and we are socially diverse and we accept this. And there's no information, it's just pure happy text. It might as well be lorem ipsum. So, so you can kind of, you have to make sure your model accounts for all of that.
Great. That's very true, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's things like there was a very famous story by, I think it was Amazon, and this again goes back to the diversity of the team. So Amazon, what they did, I suppose in this case maybe they could have got around it by applying something like supervised learning, but essentially they had a what do you call it, an algorithm that analyzed CVs. So it was in the recruiting department, and they realized after a short while that it was biased against women. And what it did was it looked into the workers that were in Amazon, and they were majority male. So it then made the assumption that male workers were better than women, because obviously why would a company have majority male if they weren't better? So any CV that came in with, I don't know, St. Catherine's Women's College, or the 2005 women's lacrosse team, it would automatically discount it because it's okay, those are not desirable features. So these are things that that you have to keep testing for, because they're kind of bias that's inherent in the system that the AI is picking up. So this is where it comes like garbage in, garbage out.
So there are a lot of data sources where we have annual reports, company websites, NGO websites, then other CSR news sources. So as you said, like over the period of time when all these kind of bias and greenwashing and these kind of things are actually affecting, like what exactly can be taken from on the particular analysis perspective, or like how efficiently we can actually come up with this kind of data.
I think it's almost an obligation. I don't think it's legal, but it's an obligation. I think with any AI research or any AI development, to have a human in the loop, HIL. So when you're doing things like finance, like medicine, you wouldn't want to go into your doctor and the doctor said, yeah, I think you've got cancer. And you say, what do you mean you think? So, well, the computers told me, so take this medicine. And you're like, well, hang on. So anywhere that there are human factors in risk, so like in investing, if you're an investment broker and you want to give solid advice to your clients, you want to make sure that the data has been verified. And in a lot of this, we use human in the loop. So there is someone at some point will verify. Well, when it's been classified as environmental, we have teams that will actually verify that that's environmental. So you can do that, and once the information is verified, then things like knowledge graphs are very useful in spotting patterns in this verified data and applying it to other data. So this I think improves efficiencies within the classification.
So regarding the portfolio exposure, like there are a lot of data services like Icon Data API or Refinity data platforms and so on and so on. How much these kind of services are actually currently used, and like what is the value proposition?
Yeah, I mean, at the minute, from what we know, so we're working with a partner on this, who work in this. They're fund managers, and that's basically the key platforms used. And so things like Icon and Bloomberg are the key platforms that are used, but the process is manual. So they'll go through these platforms and then heavily lean on them and then produce manual scoring results. And the thing is, this is very time consuming, obviously. So alternative data sources, alternative news reports they can't really dive into that. So because they simply don't have time, they don't have resource to examine everything on the web, which is where AI provides a much greater help. So AI can actually analyze much deeper sources and change what fund managers are using. So they aren't quite so reliant on the key platforms. I mean, obviously, like we talked about earlier, the verification of news. So these key platforms are usually pretty reliable sources. You can rely on them, whereas other sources are not quite so reliable. So it's not. And I'm not sure if there'll be a point in time where those resources will become kind of secondary resources. But yeah, I mean, those are the key resources at the minute, and AI is adding
Right.
extra tools
Yeah.
on top, shall we say.
So, how AI tools are overcoming the data challenge to support ESG fund managers?
Okay, so I mean, on the one case, as we mentioned before, on the one hand, they're able to supply more data. They're able to examine unstructured data sources and turn this into reporting. Uh, on another point is like what I mentioned earlier, like data visualization. So we can create dashboards that are really specific to the fund manager's needs. So they can drill down into data. They can access data in the manner they want, whether it's visual, whether it's textual, whether it's summarized. So using NLP techniques, you can summarize data. You can generate reports based on varying different data sources. And you can visualize that. So you can simply digest huge amounts of data quite quickly, and in ways that you essentially wouldn't be able to do without these techniques. So things like for example, if I don't know if a particular fund is focused on sustainable development goals, there's a EU directive of the end the I think it's called the decade of the end of poverty, which is 20 up to 2027, 2018 to 2027. So if a fund has a target on that, then they can filter through these objectives. Which companies are targeting these and how are they going. So these are kind of things that we feel are supporting ESG fund managers. But I think the overall view is automation. It's like it's AI in any sector really. I mean, this is the third AI revolution. I mean, I think this might be a topic for another podcast, but it's the automation capabilities of AI are huge in this kind of third iteration of the AI revolution. So it's not like whereas before it was a robot that did a manual task. Nowadays anything that's analytical, anything that's data gathering, anything that's when you have tools like GPT-3, with DALI, you have huge capabilities for content creation. So these kind of things, so for fund managers, for generating reports, these kind of things, AI can play a huge part there, as it will right across the board, right across any work. And the big question, like outside of this topic, the big question is, what do we do with that? If you're taking 10 hours a week off every employee in a company, what then happens? Do we keep paying them 40 hours a week, or do we pay them 30? Or it's these are big questions that AI is asking of us today, which we will need answers for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so my next question is on responsible AI and ethical AI concepts. So, like from your perspective, do you think companies are actually adapting to these kind of responsible AI methodologies when developing these kind of innovative solutions?
I I think yes and no. So I think the people who are developing AI are, I mean, in I don't know if it's discriminatory to say they're kind of a younger generation, but they're kind of millennials, and millennials have a very sustainability goals are very present in the minds of generations. There's also theoretically there's a lot of I suppose fear around AI. So what can it do? What should it? What shouldn't it do? And things like uh, AI for I don't know, military use is really quite scary. So these kind of things are very much in the mind of people who are developing them. In terms of people who are implementing them, I don't think that's there yet, because the conversations we're having with companies and with decision makers in companies, they don't necessarily understand what it is. I mean, a lot of the conversations I've had. So a lot of my work is getting companies, getting C-level executives to understand what is technology and what it can do for them. And quite often when we talk about GPT, for example, it seems like, like rocket science. It seems like, what the hell is that? How can that apply to my business? But when you explain, GPT is a predictive model. It has analyzed 175 billion data points. It looks at how they're constructed. And when you give it a phrase, it can then output, the most probable phrase that they go, okay, I can understand that. And then you start explaining, okay, how can this fit into your, I think we're there. I don't think we're at the point where people are saying, yeah, but what is the most ethical way to produce this? And then the other question is, should that be legislated? Because you always have these technologies that go way in advance of the law. So if a company has the capability of, I don't know, even influencing the market, through AI, so you could be the most advanced company, make the most advanced predictions, and then you get a name for that, and then you can actually influence the market, because what you predict is perceived as the correct or the most advanced, and then everyone else will follow you. So if you want to pump up the value of shares, you can make a prediction and then get out before it crashes. So there's a lot of questions around that. I don't think companies are quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. I think the people who are developing and testing and on the cutting edge, I think they have that very foremost in their mind, shall we say? But then again, like I say, you have a lot of unintentional bias, shall we say? So things like I mentioned, the recruiting algorithm. So that was completely unintentional. Yet it turns out to be introducing bias into the system. And if that's not detected, I don't know if that's unethical or whether it's just unfortunate. But there should be a method. For example, I'll give you an example. One of the things that we do is we make sure we test the underlying model. So you have things like BERT, for example. We will go back and test BERT regularly and see. So you can ask it questions like a woman's place in the office is, or diversity means, and depending on the answers, you can see if the model is biased or racist, or it has a particular spin on things, and you can say, okay, well, that might then need retrained. So I think in terms of ethics, maybe these are things that policymakers should be thinking about.
Yeah, I agree to that point actually, because yeah, I like, from my perspective also, I don't think we have reached up to that phase where we are able to kind of deploy a full-fledged ethical or responsible AI in place.
And I don't think the framework is there for what it means to be ethical. So and some of them are extremely difficult questions. That are not. So for example, automated driving. It goes back to at university I studied philosophy, and there's a thing called the trolley problem, and it's set up in many different ways. But essentially, you have a trolley, like a rail car going down a train tracks, and on one line, there's whatever way they set up, you're either remote or you're too far away to shout. But there are people working on the train line, and the only thing you can do is pull a lever to divert the train. But then pulling that lever, it'll kill someone else. And this is a philosophical problem, a kind of thought problem. But now, when you have AI cars, you're driving along a road and a child steps out one way and an old lady steps out the front. Who's for the chop? Is a child worth more than an old lady? these are things that, or do we kind of let the robots decide? So these are very difficult problems that AI is asking us today, and will become more and more prevalent. And I'm not sure that the general public is aware of it, which means I don't think the lawmakers are aware of it. And I don't think things like the story about the Google Lambda was conscious. There's this. I don't think things like that help, because they kind of distract from the key issues.
Right. So, my last question for today. So, regarding the differences in ESG rating, so like there have been different, very subjective definitions for materiality, normalization techniques, and aggregation weighting, a lot of different approaches across the rating agencies. So, like across the industries, we can actually see the AI or the technology actually works in a different way. If at all, if it's actually a supervised approach in managing the different ESG ratings. So, like, what exactly should be the kind of approach or the way forward for these kind of distinct approaches, or like should there be a unified approach, so that like there should be a one standard practice to kind of say this is the approach which we should take, and all the technology should align to that particular stuff. So what are your thoughts on that particular part?
Uh, yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer, because I mean, at the root, you're talking about, on the one hand, standards, and then on the other hand, kind of restraining technology. So in general, the more restraints you put on a technology, the more you can limit it. In the finance world, it's important to have limits, so because you're dealing with people's livelihoods, with people's pension funds, this kind of thing. So I think I don't necessarily, like I say, finance is not necessarily my area, so I don't have a strong opinion on that. But I know, I guess it'll have to be decided, and there'll have to be a balance. So it's like, it's the same question in the crypto world. So the whole point of crypto is a decentralization, yet financial markets want regulation. So how do you balance out decentralization with regulation? Do you simply accept the fact that the goal is decentralization, and a certain point of that will open up to criminal activities? And the same thing is with AI. I mean, do you add certain rules and regulations, or do you let the technology run ahead and see what it does? So basically, do you put a chain on it? I don't. I mean, again, this might even come down to your particular political viewpoint. So if you restrain technology, you might take away some companies' secret sauce. So they might not be able to do certain practices